Hello and welcome to Roundtable. If you can't stop global warming today, how do you manage to live with it tomorrow? With rising temperatures making life more and more dangerous, researchers are looking for ways of reducing the impact of heat waves, because they are becoming more common in Europe as the effects of climate change make themselves known. And the effects of extreme heat on human health may require changes in our behavior, our mindset, and the spaces in which we live. Good to have you along. I'm David Foster. According to some estimates, human activity is changing the planet's climate 170 times more quickly than natural causes would. But there are solutions, we're told, to slowing that down. Heavy traffic, urban development, millions of people using up resources. It is easy to see why the world's cities are centers of carbon consumption. The impact of heat is magnified in cities, and with almost 70% now of the world's population expected to live in cities by 2050, thinking about heat extremes within urban planning is essential. But what does that mean? And what are some of the sustainable solutions when designing better built cities for the future? Well, we leave our particular sprawling glass monolith here in the middle of London to go to Egham in Surrey, and David Simon joins us from there, Professor of Geography at Royal Holloway University of London. Then we head out to Oxford and we say hello to Radhika Khosla, Associate Professor at the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development, who grew up in a very big city, that is Delhi. And then we go to the other side of the world, Sydney, and we say hello in Australia to Mattheos Santamouris, Professor of High Performance Architecture at the University of New South Wales. You all have your own perspective, which is fantastic on this program. Matt, I want to come to you first of all. You've spent a lifetime, I would imagine, studying this, but I want to ask you if you can summarize it as short a time as possible, how one of your aims is achieved, and that is to decrease the temperatures of urban areas. Is there an obvious way to do that?
Depends on the type, of the cities and the problem we face in the cities. Actually, we have more than 250, large-scale implementation of mitigation projects in cities, in large-scale cities. We have succeeded to decrease the temperature up to 2.5 degrees. We expect in the near future to decrease the temperature with the use of the super cool materials up to 4 or 5 degrees.
So it's materials, and it's also what?
And materials, materials, greenery, evaporative techniques, decrease of the anthropogenic heat release in the city, and many other issues.
And is it achievable for a reasonable budget? I mean, in other words, can those countries that can't afford very much afford to do this, or can they not afford not to?
Absolutely. But I have to tell you that the cost of non-action, is much, much higher. If we don't really act, if we really do not follow proactive, agendas, the cost, of the overheating is tremendous. The cost of mitigation technologies is about 1/10, of the cost of the overheating in our cities.
So Matt is talking, Radhika, there about mitigation. In other words, taking a problem and making it not quite so much of a problem. But I'm thinking about design from the very beginning. How useful would it be to be able to start from scratch? You're from Delhi, which clearly didn't start from scratch, and most cities don't because they're organic. They just grow and grow and grow.
That's right. So starting from scratch is actually key and interesting. Like that's an opportunity, especially for the developing world, which is growing at the moment. What we have to remember is that infrastructure shapes the solution space. So how infrastructure is built, how cities are built, actually shapes the possible solutions that you could put in place. Now, if infrastructure is built with high reflectivity, the right materials, the right orientation, you start out with a system that actually has much more room for sustainable cooling and heat resilience than if you don't.
And is that sort of material now much more widely available than it was, let's say, 25, 30 years ago, at a reasonable cost?
Yes. And a lot of those materials are also nature-based. So simple things like shading, providing ventilation, having green surfaces, having smart surfaces with high reflectivity. Often that's painting of white, just having white color and white paint, on surfaces. All of those make a huge difference in reducing the urban heat island effect and the extra warming, the 2 times higher warming that cities are seeing compared to the rest of the world.
You've got to be awfully careful, though. You now live in London, and I'm thinking of one particular building which was known as the walkie-talkie because of its shape, and it was designed to reflect light, and it dazzled everybody in the streets below.
Well, that's right, but I live in Oxford and we don't have that problem of dazzling buildings. But the important thing about reflectivity is that it has to go hand in hand with the orientation and the sort of the urban canyon in the way that it's designed. And there is ample scientific evidence that reflectivity and increasing that albedo value for materials, for surfaces, whether it is rooftops, whether it is roads and pavements, does make a big difference in reducing the heat that is actually absorbed inside buildings and then enters bodies.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you to ask you specific questions about sustainability in developing countries, because that's your particular area of expertise. But David, I want to bring you in. A few years ago, you were associated with Mr. Urban Future, putting together partnerships to see how we can all live in big places, big cities in years to come. And one of the things you said was, or it says, is to identify the challenges in urban sustainability. Rather like I said to Matt, you know, you've spent years looking at this. Can you summarize that, the challenges in urban sustainability, in about 30, 40 seconds?
Yeah, and of course, it's very easy to generalize, but the world is diverse and every city, and indeed every part of a city, is different. And part of the message and the key recipes that we developed within Mr. Urban Futures was not to work on the basis of a blueprint that you then rolled out and replicated everywhere, but to find out guidelines of good practice and provide people with the tools to adapt them to their local circumstances. So if you're trying to retrofit, just picking up the previous conversation, an existing area, you need to approach it in a very different way from if you're building a new extension to an urban area or starting a new planned city, like some of the new India's 100 smart cities that are being built from scratch. You can design them with the latest materials, with the orientation of the buildings. But when you're retrofitting an existing urban fabric, it's much more challenging. And what we did was to bring the different stakeholders together. So the local authorities, community-based organizations, universities, other research institutes at local, national, regional level, and also residents of the different neighborhoods to hammer out ideas and explore what would be acceptable to all of them, but also socially, environmentally, and culturally appropriate in a particular context.
Mattheos and Radhika, this is for either one of you. We'll get to the costs in just a moment. But I want to show you, since David brings up modern, start from scratch buildings and cities, these three, this is the line in Saudi Arabia, that's what it's called, a 170-kilometer long, 500-meter tall, what they call linear city that is planned. It's extraordinary if you think of the height of that 500 meters. Tolosa, that is in the United States, Danish architect, planning to build what he calls the most sustainable city in the world. Looks as though it's got a couple of flying saucers above it at the moment. That really is futuristic. And then we go to the Maldives, sinking at the moment because of rising sea levels. This would be a floating city for 20,000 people, could be ready as soon as 2024. Let's try you, Radhika. Is it sensible to start again rather than try to adapt?
I think innovative projects are interesting. They should be, they have their space. I don't necessarily see these models as scalable models for many parts of the world that may not have the resources, may not have the available geographies to be able to do that. But I do think that there will be lessons that come out of these types of experiments. And so I would really see these as laboratories of experiments where we don't know what the output will be.
And it's not going to come cheap, is it? Because here we are from the United Nations, some climate change adaptation spending. In other words, what you need to fork out to get what you want. $70 billion needed for developing countries. $100 billion promised by wealthy countries. I wonder how much of that has actually arrived. The United States spending around about $45 billion in 2023. And the European Union, all part of the EU COVID recovery fund, just under 1,000 billion. I think that's probably $1 trillion for that entire fund, a third of it going for renewables. Matt, that's a lot of money from the European Union and from other countries, but you say Europe doesn't get this at all.
In reality, the total capital that we need, or the total budget, in order really to minimize the emissions because of the energy system, according to Bloomberg, is close to $180 trillion by 2050. So by spending 100 billions per year, we will never have decarbonization. So I think that we have to increase, the budget we are spending for decarbonization. If we really wish to avoid, an increase of the temperature above 2 degrees.
And is that why you say Europe, and that's an example you give us, says 1 year, oh my goodness, we must spend lots of money on this, but as soon as the temperature falls, and of course right now it's very, very hot, as soon as the temperature falls, it puts that away and regards it as a problem for another day. Kicking the can down the road, it's called.
Yeah, it is true, The problem is that actually we know very well, the path we have to follow, or we know several paths we have to follow. And we know also how much we have to spend. We know who has to spend the money, and we know, how we have to proceed in the future. I'm afraid that this is not what we're doing actually. Unfortunately, most of the let's say developing countries, they don't have the resources to proceed. In most of the African countries, despite the need for decarbonization, they install huge carbon and coal electricity generation, plants. So I think, and I'm not very optimistic, I think that actually, although we have agreed, in Paris and after, to keep and follow a decarbonization agenda, it seems that this is not follow. It seems that we are, working on a completely different path.
David, a few years ago when you were working for Mistra, you were part of a team that prepared a paper, one sentence from which was urban research is disparate, marginalized and ill-prepared to interact effectively with global policy. And this is headline, scientists must have a say in the future of cities. Too many politicians, not enough proper cooks. Has that changed?
I think the balance is changing, and there is now a third report in production from the Urban Climate Research Network, Urban Cities Climate Research Network, which attempts to do for cities what the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change has done nationally and internationally. And that is to synthesize urban knowledge in relation to climate change, sustainability, and resilience, and update these every 7 or 8 years. But it's a huge amount of work, synthesizing, like the IPCC reports, a vast amount of information. But I think it's also imperative to realize, as was just being said, that we have enough knowledge to pursue broad lines of adaptation and mitigation, and indeed urban transformation towards greater sustainability and resilience. What frustrates me greatly is the way many politicians and, frankly, some academics claim that there isn't enough evidence yet and we need more research, which is also, as you put it, kicking the can down the road of another sort. We need locally specific work. There are certain specific gaps, but broadly speaking, we cannot afford to delay any longer in the name of greater precision from research, with a few notable exceptions.
Radhika, we've talked principally about buildings, but with more and more people arriving in cities, whether they're organic or purpose-built, there's going to be a need for more food, for more water, for more sanitation, for better planning. That's as important, isn't it, as letting heat out of a building or keeping people cool, keeping them alive through food and water?
That's right. And for any urban space, whether it is in a developing country or not, the urban space always has multiple priorities. And these priorities include climate change, but they also include many other things like job security, like the provision of water, provision of clean air, crime, all kinds of other things. And the challenge with climate change in some sense is that it acts as an exacerbator and a stress multiplier to the number of existing vulnerabilities that are already in an urban space. But the good news is that climate change, if dealt with, has a number of synergies with these other priorities. So if climate change is being acted upon, so for instance, if we do take measures for mitigation and adaptation of extreme heat, then we are also benefiting a number of other different priorities that urban spaces have, which are things like productivity, food security, thermal comfort, just to name a few. So I think sort of seeing this as a dichotomy is incorrect. It's actually climate change interaction with each of these existing multiple priorities and objectives that urban spaces have, that national governments have, and that international policy has.
You two, David, and you, Matt, were both nodding in agreement with some of the things that we had there from Radhika. But David, I've just heard from you, so I'm going to go to you. Matt, what is it that most interested you about what you just heard?
You know, I think that during the very last years, there is a tremendous, progress in mitigation technologies and also in adaptation technologies. Actually, we are able to decrease the peak temperature of cities up to 4 degrees. I will work on some major, mitigation projects all around the world. We're responsible for, the Riyadh, Saudi Arabia mitigation project by using super cool materials and some other techniques. Together with Berkeley University in California, we have succeeded to decrease temperature up to 4 degrees. We have a similar project now in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, also in Calcutta and Houston in the United States, but also 250 other projects, where mitigation techniques have been applied, monitored. And I think, I'm quite optimistic that we can really decrease the strength of the overheating in our cities. So we have the technology. I fully agree that we don't have to wait. We don't have to convince, any more, politicians and decision makers. We are ready really to decrease the temperature of the cities, and we need really to have a proactive agenda on it.
Let's hear from the former mayor of Vancouver on the west coast of Canada.
We need clear signals from governments, and we need the climate finance advanced. We need the money to flow to cities, particularly in the global south. There are countless cities that are growing at scary rates and facing huge impacts, floods, droughts, fires. These cities need resources. They need investment, and in many cases they have projects ready to go. They can get electric buses on the ground, they can get drought-resistant water systems in place, they can protect themselves with viable projects that businesses are ready to partner on as well.
He says it's a priority for governments, but there's only a limited amount of resources to go around. Don't we have to look at this from an actuarial point of view and say, okay, an awful lot of these people are old. The majority of people are just going to be a bit uncomfortable. Yes, more people may die because the temperatures are going up, but they're old anyway. It doesn't really matter too much, et cetera, and spend your money somewhere else.
Well, that's also often an excuse. And I think what is important is that everybody take some responsibility rather than sitting passively waiting for the government or the politicians or the mayor or whoever it might be. There's lots that individual households and citizens can do, from capturing water, rainwater harvesting as it's called, to water the garden or use it for washing the car, which doesn't have to be pristine chlorinated water. Installing, as in the UK, where only a minority of homes still have water meters, installing meters which helps you to control your usage and actually cut your costs in the process, unless you're a very profligate household. People are investing at the individual level around the world in solar panels, in better insulation, in rethinking how they undertake their daily activities to combine journeys and therefore reduce the number of kilometers or miles that they drive, therefore the cost of fuel, and crucially the greenhouse gas emissions from the vehicle.
Okay, so it doesn't all have to come from the government. We can help ourselves. Radhika,
Absolutely.
Let me ask you about this.
It's everybody's responsibility. Yeah.
The mayor says we can get drought-resistant water systems in place. Now, I'd love to know what they are.
So I'm not a water expert, but the point is that getting systems in place that actually help us to deal with the kind of extreme heat that we have is really important. So even if we move away from the water example and just sort of ask that question in terms of how do you get a system in place that actually prevents that kind of damage that this current drought is causing, putting in place passive measures for cooling that are not energy intensive, but actually allow there to be the thermal comfort and comfort for productivity at the level of the building without using the energy intensive cooling systems that we have is a means of getting resistance and resilience from the drought conditions that we're seeing.
Thank you for that. Even though it wasn't your area of expertise, I sprung that on you. I'm sure you wished you'd had a bit more warning about that one, but I appreciate your honesty and the fact that you gave us another answer as well. Matt, let me come to you. I was saying earlier on, it's just oldies like me that are going to suffer because of the extreme heat. They're just going to be uncomfortable, the rest of the population. But I want to know how far you think we've come in terms of overcoming some of the problems that we have.
The problems, of overheating are really variable and have to do first with thermal comfort, have to do with tremendous, increase of the energy consumption of the buildings, a tremendous increase of the peak electricity demand, an increase of heat-related mortality and morbidity, an increase of the atmospheric ozone. There are many issues. So how we can really, act and how far we can go. Actually, we have the technology, mitigation technology, really to decrease the temperature of cities up to 4 degrees. This can be done. We have done it in 250 projects. We expect in the near future to increase also, the magnitude of, of mitigation. On the other hand, adaptation is extremely important and may help a lot. And better buildings, better insulation, better shading, more efficient cooling system may help a lot. But on the other hand, we need to have, both mitigation and adaptation. If we just focus on adaptation, at the end we will have very efficient buildings and we will live, indoors with air conditioning and perhaps air conditioning, using renewable energy sources. But our patterns of life will change completely. We will not live outdoors because of the high temperatures. So it is very important really to face the problem by using and implementing mitigation and adaptation technologies at the same time. We have the knowledge really to understand the problems. We have the knowledge to implement mitigation and adaptation technologies. We have to do more research, but actually, we are able to decrease the temperature of the cities up to 4 degrees for sure.
Extraordinary. Radhika, he talks about we have the knowledge, but isn't it fair to say that most of the knowledge is in, if you like, the global north, the developed countries, and not in the global south, where most of the problems happen to be? How do you redress that balance?
Well, I would say that there is actually a lot of knowledge in the global south. There is a lot of knowledge because a lot of the regions in the global south are not strangers to heat. They have lived with extreme heat for long periods of time, and they have mechanisms, practices, technologies, cultures that actually enable living with these high temperatures without using the energy intensive technologies of the West. Now, the challenge is that as these countries transition, they often aspire to certain standards of technology and living that are aping the West and often aping the mistakes of the West. So this idea of having climate controlled interiors that are not in conversation with the outdoor space and the local climate is actually really problematic. And the rise of air conditioning, as we know from around the world, is a great example of this, which in the end is going to do more detriment because it has a terrible feedback loop when air conditioning based on fossil fuels actually increases the need for more air conditioning because of the heat that it lets out and the fossil fuels that it leads to. So to answer your question, I think there is immense knowledge in all parts of the world, and the challenge is in bringing that to the fore, understanding what is locally relevant, what resonates with local capacities and capabilities, and how that can be scaled.
Okay, I'm just going to stop you there because we're running out of time and I want to give David one last word on this one. I'm sure it's something you've all got an opinion on. Is there one city in the world that we should look to and say, you've pretty much got it right, everybody else should follow?
Well, as I said, there's no silver bullet or magic bullet. everywhere has to be adapted to local circumstances, whether it's in Northern Europe and North America, where we now have 2 energy consumption peaks per annum, precisely because of the summer cooling that we were just hearing about, as well as the traditional winter heating, or indeed in parts of the global south, where colleagues of mine in Ghana, for example, recently did a study that showed, measuring internal, external temperatures as they rise, that many people in hospitals, blacksmiths, other categories of workers were struggling to work at temperatures upwards of 41 degrees Celsius. Impossible. Their productivity goes down, health and welfare declines, and of course the most vulnerable people, who may be the elderly, as you alluded to earlier, but often infants, young children, anybody with underlying health conditions become the first victims. So it's very real, it's very tangible, and we have to act now.
And that there was a politician's answer. I give you one question, you give me an answer about something entirely different, but very informative. Listen, thank you, each and every one of you, for coming on the show. There is no perfect city. That's the answer. From me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team, thank you very much for watching. We hope to have you with us next time. Till then, goodbye.